You're standing in the egg aisle. You lift the carton. You check the price twice, because it just can't be right. And then you notice something else. The carton itself got smaller. Fewer eggs. More money. Same tired shrug. 2 weeks ago, I stood in my own cold cellar, holding an egg I had stored 11 months earlier. No fridge, no power to it. I cracked it into the pan, and it fried up perfect. Firm white. Bright yolk. 11 months. Here's what I now believe, and I'll show you every step that got me here. Canadians used to keep a full year of eggs in a crock in the corner of the kitchen, bought cheap when they were plentiful, eaten straight through the coldest winter. We didn't lose that skill by accident. We were quietly talked out of it. And that forgetting is the exact reason the price on that carton has you cornered today. I found the proof buried in an old Dominion Department of Agriculture bulletin, older than my own grandmother. By the end of this, you'll have the whole method, and it works in a downtown apartment just as well as it works on a farm. You don't need land. You don't need a renovation. You need a bucket and about 10 minutes. So let me take you back to where this started, because I didn't believe a word of it at first. It started with my neighbor, Walter, 81 years old, lives up the road from me, keeps a garden that would make you weep, it's so tidy. Last February, deep February, the kind where the snow squeaks under your boots, I was complaining to him about egg prices over the fence. And he just looked at me, kind of puzzled, and said, "Why are you buying eggs in February?" I didn't understand the question. Where else would I get eggs in February? He waved me inside. And in a back room off his kitchen, cool but not freezing, there was a white enamel pail with a lid on it. He lifted the lid, and inside was cloudy water and eggs. Dozens of them, just sitting there. He reached in bare-handed, pulled 2 out, rinsed them under the tap, and made me an omelet right there. Those eggs had been in that pail since the previous May. 9 months. And I'm telling you, it was the best omelet I'd had in years. I asked him how. He shrugged like I'd asked him how to tie his shoes. Water glass, he said. My mother did it, everybody did it. And that was the whole answer he had. He didn't know the science. He didn't know the history. He just knew it worked, because his mother showed him, and her mother showed her. I drove home that night gnawing on it. Because if everybody used to do this, if it was as ordinary as tying your shoes, then how did I get to be 59 years old and never once hear about it? That's the question that started the whole dig. That's the loose thread I pulled. And the more I pulled, the more the whole sweater came apart. So the first thing I did was try to figure out what water glass even was. And that led me somewhere I did not expect. Walter's water glass turned out to be a real product with a real chemical name, sodium silicate. And once I had that name, the trail lit up like a runway. Because sodium silicate egg preservation isn't some backwoods folk trick a few old-timers stumbled into, it was mainstream science, printed in official government literature, taught to Canadian and American housewives for generations. Let me give you the picture. Back before electric refrigeration reached ordinary homes, and that's later than you'd think, plenty of rural Canadian homes had no fridge until the 1950s. A fresh egg was a seasonal thing. Hens lay like crazy in spring and early summer, when the days are long. They nearly stop in the dead of winter when the light is short. So in spring you'd be drowning in eggs, and by January you'd have almost none. Cheap in May, precious in December. Sound familiar? So people did the obvious thing. They saved the surplus. And the very best way to do it, the way the experts landed on after testing everything, was to submerge fresh eggs in a solution of sodium silicate and water. The silicate seals the shell. It seeps into those thousands of tiny pores and closes them off, so no air gets in and no moisture gets out. An egg goes bad because air and bacteria creep through the shell, seal the shell, and you've stopped the clock. I found the numbers, and the numbers are what turned me from a skeptic into a believer. Properly water-glassed eggs kept 8 to 9 months easy, and often past a full year, at nothing more than a cool room temperature. One old bulletin I dug up reported that after 8 months in solution, the eggs were still graded fit for eating with barely any loss. That's not a fridge, that's not a freezer, that's a pail in a back room. And here's the part that made me sit back in my chair. The cost of the sodium silicate to preserve a huge batch of eggs was pennies. Pennies to lock in spring prices and eat them all winter. Walter wasn't saving a few dollars. Over a lifetime, a family doing this was saving a small fortune, quietly, without ever thinking of it as saving. So I had my answer to the how. But now I had a bigger, itchier question. If this was official, printed, government endorsed, dirt cheap, and it plainly worked, why did it vanish so completely that a curious man in his late 50s had never heard of it? Skills don't just evaporate. Somebody stops passing them down. And usually, somebody benefits when they do. I wasn't ready to answer that yet. But there was one more piece of the egg itself I had to understand first, because it turned out to be the whole hidden key. Here's the piece nobody told me, and it flipped my understanding of the grocery store completely. A fresh egg, straight from a hen, comes wearing a natural coating. It's called the bloom, or the cuticle. It's a thin, invisible, slightly waxy layer the hen puts on the shell as the egg is laid. And that bloom is nature's own preservative. It seals those pores from day one. It's the reason a hen can leave a clutch of eggs sitting in a nest for 2 weeks, and they're all still good enough to hatch. Now here's what stopped me cold. In much of Europe, to this day, you'll walk into a shop, and the eggs are sitting on a regular shelf, room temperature, no refrigeration at all. And they're perfectly safe. Why? Because over there they don't wash the bloom off. The egg keeps its natural armor. In North America, we do the opposite. Commercial eggs here are power washed before they ever reach that carton. The washing scrubs the bloom right off. And once the bloom is gone, the shell is wide open, thousands of little pores exposed to the air. That is precisely why our eggs must be kept cold, and why they're stamped with a best before date that feels like it arrives about 4 days after you get them home. Think about what that means. We took an egg that nature designed to keep itself for weeks, and we deliberately stripped away the thing that protected it, and then we sold ourselves the refrigerator, the packaging, and the short shelf life as if that were just how eggs are. It isn't how eggs are. It's how we made them. Water glassing works because the sodium silicate does the same job the bloom used to do. It seals the shell right back up. That's the whole secret. You're just replacing the armor we washed away. And that reframed my entire question about the grocery store. Because what folks are noticing lately, the shrinking cartons, the leaping prices, the food that spoils faster than it should, that's not a glitch. That's the natural endpoint of a system that spent 100 years teaching us to depend on it for everything, and to store nothing ourselves. The less you can keep on your own, the more often you have to come back and pay their price, every single week. Now, I want to be careful, because I chased a lot of dead ends before I understood who actually gained from all this forgetting. So let me walk you back to the archives, because that's where the trail got interesting and a little dark. I went looking for exactly when this knowledge was strongest, so I could find out when it started to die, and it pointed me straight at wartime. During the Second World War, the Canadian government leaned on home food preservation harder than at any point in our history. There was a body called the Wartime Prices and Trade Board, set up in 1939, and its whole job was managing shortages and prices on the home front. Eggs and other staples were rationed and controlled. Families were actively encouraged to preserve their own food so that fresh supplies could go to the troops and to Britain. Water glassing eggs was part of that push. So was canning, so was root cellaring, so was rendering your own fat. Preserving food at home wasn't quaint back then. It was considered your patriotic duty and your plain good sense, both at once. A woman who could put up a year of eggs and a cellar full of vegetables was respected for it. That knowledge was living, shared over fences exactly the way Walter's mother shared it with him. I found household guides from that era that laid the method out plainly, right alongside recipes and mending tips. The sodium silicate was sold at the hardware store, and the druggist under names like egg preserver and water glass. It was as common as baking soda. My grandmother would have known it the way she knew how to darn a sock. So the knowledge was at full strength in the 1940s, which meant something had to come along right after the war and knock it flat. something powerful enough to make an entire nation forget a skill it had just been praised for. And when I found what that something was, I understood that nobody had to burn a single book to bury this. They just had to make it feel old-fashioned. But before I show you who did the burying, I have to stop and talk to you directly, especially if you've been sitting there thinking this is all very nice for people with a farm and a cold cellar, but not for you. Because I know some of you are in an apartment, or a rented townhouse, or a small place with no basement, no cold room, nothing that looks like Walter's back porch. And every video about this kind of thing seems to assume you've got 40 acres and a barn. So I'm going to speak straight to you now, because this next part is built for exactly your situation, and it's the part that convinced me anyone can do this. You do not need a cold cellar. You need a spot that stays reasonably cool and steady, a bottom kitchen cupboard against an outside wall, the floor of a closet, under the bed in a spare room, the back of a pantry, anywhere that stays roughly cellar cool and out of direct sun will do. The eggs don't need to be cold like a fridge. They just need to be steady and out of the heat, and you do not need a giant crock. Walter uses an enamel pail, sure, but a food-grade plastic bucket with a lid works. A large glass jar works. A stainless pot with a cover works. I started my very first batch in a 2-gallon glass jar I already had sitting empty in the cupboard, tucked into the bottom of my hall closet, and, I forgot it was even there. That's the beauty of it. Once it's set, it just sits quietly and does its job. Here's the one thing you truly cannot skip, and it matters more in an apartment than anywhere. The eggs must be fresh and unwashed, with that natural bloom still on them. That rules out the standard washed eggs from the big grocery chain, because their armor is already gone, but it does not rule you out at all. You go to a farmer's market. You find someone at your workplace or your building who keeps a few backyard hens. There are more of them than you'd guess. You ask for unwashed eggs, farm fresh, and you'll usually get them cheaper than the store besides. You brush off any dirt gently with a dry cloth, you never rinse them, and into the solution they go. One person in a one-bedroom apartment can put up 10 or 12 dozen eggs in a single bucket the size of a small garbage pail, tuck it in a closet, and have good eggs to eat well past the following spring. No permit, no landlord permission, no contractor. Nobody even has to know it's there. If you can store a case of water bottles, you can store a year of eggs, so please don't count yourself out. This wasn't a rich person's trick or a landowner's trick. It was a get-through-the-winter trick for ordinary working families in cramped city row houses, just as much as farmhouses. And that's exactly why it made certain people nervous. Because a family that can feed itself cheaply from a closet is a family that needs the store a little less. And that brings me to what happened after the war. Here's what knocked it flat. It wasn't a law. It wasn't a ban. It was a refrigerator and a very good advertising department. After the Second World War, the electric refrigerator went from a luxury to a must-have in just about a decade. Through the late 1940s and the 1950s, the fridge marched into nearly every Canadian kitchen, and the companies selling them, and the growing supermarket chains selling the food to fill them, had every reason in the world to sell you a new idea, along with the appliance. The idea was this: fresh is modern, and modern means you buy it, you cool it, and you buy it again next week. Preserving your own food got quietly rebranded. It went from patriotic and wise to backward and poor. A crock of eggs in the corner wasn't a sign of a clever, self-reliant household anymore. It was made to feel like something your struggling grandmother did because she didn't know any better. And no young couple in a shiny new 1950s kitchen wanted to look like that. They wanted the humming white fridge and the trip to the bright new supermarket. That was the future. So the mothers stopped teaching it to the daughters. Not because it stopped working, it worked exactly as well as it always had, but because it started to feel like something to be a little ashamed. And within a single generation, a skill that had been as common as bread went nearly silent. Walter kept it because Walter's mother was stubborn and set in her ways, and, thank God for that. Most families just let it slip through their fingers. Now follow the money, because this is the part that put a knot in my stomach. Every skill you lose is a purchase you gain. When you can't store eggs, you buy them 52 weeks a year at whatever price they set. When you can't keep vegetables through winter, you buy imported ones all season at a premium. When you can't preserve anything, you become a perfect customer, one who has to come back every few days, forever, with no ability to wait out a high price or stock up on a low one. That's the machine folks are finally noticing at the grocery store. The shrinking package, the climbing price, the spoiling produce, none of it hurts you the way it does if you have no ability to store, to buffer, to say no thanks, I'm set for now. 100 years ago, a family could ride out a bad egg price for months. Today, most of us can't ride it out for a week. That helplessness didn't happen to us. It was sold to us, one shiny appliance and one clever ad at a time. If this way of thinking resonates with you, the idea that ordinary Canadians once held real, practical knowledge that kept them fed and free on their own terms, I've put together a book that goes much deeper into exactly this territory. It's called Canadian Edge, and it's part of a series that includes Deep Canadian and Canadian Complete. These books are where I've gathered the methods, the history, and the forgotten skills that don't fit into a single video, the kind of thorough, usable reference you can come back to again and again. You'll find the details on how to get a copy linked in the description below. And that brings me to what happened after the war. And the deepest trick of all is that nobody had to force it. They just had to make the old way feel embarrassing and let us do the forgetting ourselves. That's why the trail went cold. Not hidden in a vault, just laughed out of the kitchen. But it was never actually gone. It was sitting in old bulletins and in a few stubborn back rooms like Walter's, waiting. And that's where my dig finally paid off, because I didn't just want to hear about it. I wanted the exact, original, proven method, in the words of the people who tested it. So let me give you what I found. This is the whole thing. The document that pulled it all together for me was a Dominion Department of Agriculture publication from the early 1900s, the era when the government's own experimental farms were testing every home preservation method they could and reporting back plainly on what worked. And what they landed on, again and again, as the best and most reliable method for the ordinary household was sodium silicate water glass. This wasn't folklore anymore. This was the results of real testing, written down by the people who did it. Here is that method exactly, so you can do it this weekend. First, your eggs. You want them as fresh as you can get, ideally within a few days of being laid and unwashed, with the bloom intact. This is the single most important rule. Never use a cracked egg, never use a dirty one you've had to scrub, and never use a washed store egg. Just brush any loose bits off with a dry cloth. Set aside any egg with even a hairline crack, because one bad egg can spoil the batch. Second, your solution. You get sodium silicate, you can find it sold as water glass or as an egg-preserving solution, and it's still available online and at some hardware and farm suppliers, cheap. The classic proportion from the old bulletins is 1 part sodium silicate to about 10 parts water. And here's a detail the old-timers were firm about. Use water that has been boiled and then cooled completely. Boiling drives off anything in the water that might cause trouble, and cooling it means you're not shocking the eggs. Stir the silicate into the cooled water until it's fully mixed. It'll look a little cloudy and feel slightly slippery, almost like a thin syrup. That's exactly right. Third, the packing. Take a clean crock, food-grade bucket, or large glass jar. Gently place your eggs in, small end down if you can manage it, and stack them up without cracking any. Then pour your solution over top until the eggs are covered by at least 2 inches of liquid. That extra couple of inches matters, because any egg that pokes above the surface as the level drops can spoil. Put a lid or a plate over the top to keep dust and light out. Then set it in that cool, steady spot we talked about and leave it be. That's it. That is the entire secret that fed families through Canadian winters for generations. A pail, some cheap silicate, boiled water, and fresh, unwashed eggs. Now let me give you the 2 things that make you look like you've done it your whole life. When you go to use an egg, lift it out, rinse the solution off under the tap, and give it a good look and smell the same common sense your grandmother would use. And because water glassing very slightly changes the shell, do not hard-boil these eggs whole. The shell can crack in boiling water. Instead, prick a tiny hole in the wide end with a pin before boiling, or simply use them for frying, scrambling, baking, and everything else, which is what folks did anyway. Fresh in spring when they're cheap and plentiful, into the pail they go, and you're eating your own good eggs deep into the next winter while the store price does whatever it wants and you couldn't care less. I did it myself. That 11-month-old egg I cracked into the pan at the start that was my own first batch, packed the way that old bulletin described, sitting in a bucket in my closet. Walter was right. His mother was right. And every ad man who told a young couple in 1955 that this was backward and poor was wrong and knew it and sold the fridge anyway. So here's what I really pulled out of that cold cellar. It wasn't just an egg. It was the plain, forgotten ability to feed my own family on my own terms, without asking a grocery chain's permission or paying its weekly toll. That's the thing that got taken from us, one shiny kitchen at a time. And it turns out it was never locked away at all. It was just waiting in an old government bulletin and in Walter's stubborn back room for somebody to go looking. If you're the kind of person who has always felt in your gut that we used to know how to get by better than we do now, that real, useful knowledge got quietly swept aside because our helplessness was worth more to somebody than our self-reliance, then you already understand exactly what this is. You're not imagining it. You were right all along. And now you've got one solid piece of it back, in your own hands, to use in your own home. So, tell me one thing, and I mean it. Actually type it out for me down in the comments. Did anyone in your family, a grandmother, an aunt, an old neighbor like my Walter ever keep eggs in a pail of cloudy water, or put food up in a way the rest of us forgot? What did they call it, and where were they from? I read every one of these, and together we're piecing back something that was almost lost. So leave that comment. Don't just nod along and scroll away, and if you want to stand with the folks who are digging this knowledge back up and refusing to let it stay buried, subscribe and stay with me. Because the next thing I found in those same old bulletins stopped me in my tracks, a way our great-grandparents kept butter fresh for a full year on the counter. No fridge, no salt cellar, using nothing but water, and a simple dish shaped a particular way. I've already tested it, and once you see how easy it was, you're going to be just as angry and just as glad as I was. I'll show you everything next time. Before you go, if this video helped, there's a deeper version waiting for our members. You can ask me your own question and a real person answers, and you'll be among thousands of folks just like you. Point your phone's camera at the code on screen. It takes less than a minute, and you can cancel anytime, no risk.